Hello, folks. I wanted to record this little presentation. I gave this talk earlier this week to a class at the University of Central Florida, and I figured I should also release it on Patreon because why not? So I'm going to talk a little bit about creating interactive worlds. So this is kind of designing and world building for these live action environments. Let's get started. So who am I? Well, if you're watching this, you probably know, but I'm Carol Murphy. I am an expert on creating live action interactive works. I've got over 20 years of experience, both at Incantrix Productions, Playable Theater, at Disney, and I've been an adjunct professor at Northeastern University for a long time as well. I want to talk about kind of this idea. I have this idea about the kind of broad category of what are the kind of immersive arts or interactive arts. So I've tried mapping it out on these axes, which I think are this 2D diagram is a little bit insufficient. So on the x-axis, you can see that I'm thinking about kind of like your participants and the amount of agency that they have in any of these given art forms. And then along the y-axis, you've got your transportative physical environment. So that means like, how immersive is the environment that you're in, where I think that there are things that are kind of immersive art exhibits that just like, span across a lot of different types of interactivity. Some are like stationary and stable. Some of them are very participatory. You've got kind of your traditional theater, which I think can, move up into this category as well. Environmental theater, which is kind of like where the audience stands in the environment, but isn't necessarily like participating in any meaningful way. Immersive theater, which I think is actually a sort of narrow category of the type of theater where participants have some agency, but it's really limited agency. Then you've got participatory theater, which asks for audience participation, but in like really generic ways, right? Where it's like you're going to be pulled up into something that is rather on rails. Interactive theater, which is getting a little more to the kind of game side of things, where things are starting to be a lot more agency. There's a lot more interactivity that's going on. And then LARP, which has, of course, the most agency, and LARPs can look like a lot of different things. So I'm kind of like in this talk, I'm talking about a lot of these different forms, but I'm broadly kind of pointing at the things that are over here, the interactive theater and LARP side of things as I'm thinking about these different things. I also wanted to add that I've been thinking about how I think there's a Z axis here, which is also this idea of gamification, like how much crunchy bits do you actually have in your different experiences? Um, and I think that that allows us to kind of like map out like, oh, maybe interactive theater is actually more of this like 3D kind of thing, and LARP is a little bit more of this 3D kind of thing. And that lets us put things like escape rooms in this diagram and things like that too, right? Where I think that there's like room for more thinking about how we think about these different arts. So I want to talk a little bit about the like process of how we build this kind of work, foundations, so fundamentals for getting started with actually writing this type of work, your world building, then laying down some of your kind of game matrix of your formats and your mechanics, and then making solid interactive characters. I'm going to touch on all these things very briefly. They are deep topics, and each one of these topics could probably have their own talk. But for now, I'm just going to talk about all these things as like an overall to give you a flavor of how I think about this stuff. So process, we're going to have a kind of a high level view of steps involved when it comes to bringing this type of art to life. So all this starts with story, right? We're always thinking about storytelling in these types of environments. So a story is a setting and characters and relationships, and that gets you plot or events and conflicts, right? So if you have a setting, character, and relationships, these things often kind of start to develop all on their own, right? But a story is a little bit different than an interactive story. So an interactive story has your setting and your characters and relationships, but they're modified. You also have interaction mechanics, right? There are modes and sort of expectations that there's going to be some sort of involvement of your participants. Your interactive characters are also going to be a little different in this format. You're also going to have characters who have needs, needs that can only be fulfilled by the audience, but we're going to get into that later. So here's the steps to what I think are kind of interactive play. So step one, you kind of have to have a setting. You need to create your world. Step two, you need to have kind of your game matrix. You need, and this is something that you can modify and change as you go along, but you kind of need to have your structure for how you're going to moderate the outcomes. Then step three, you kind of create characters, and these characters have these unfulfilled needs, as I mentioned before. Step four, you create relationships, which adds a layer of dynamicism. And then step five, you start to introduce the participants. And with that, you start to introduce this idea of steering. And we'll talk about what that is a little bit later. So step one, creating setting. So this includes your location, cosmology, theme, tone, time period, genre, aesthetics, all that stuff, right? It's a huge topic. We're going to dive into it a little bit. And you may or may not have a lot of control over your setting, depending on the nature of your project. I think it's really helpful to use something called scaffolding. So scaffolding is the idea of building within existing genres or known tropes. That helps your participants to get more immersed more quickly. So the more accessible your setting is, the easier time people are going to have with playing along. It's also really important that your audience can suspend their disbelief. So when you're choosing a setting for this type of work, it's helpful if you think about how you're going to represent it, like how you're actually going to create the physical environment. And when you're in doubt, kind of here's a helpful rule called the 80-20 rule. So 80% taken from real world inspiration, and then 20% taken from your imaginary world, right? And that can be a helpful rule of thumb for any kind of designing as well. Step two, you're going to create your game matrix. So your game matrix is all the different components of what is going to make your game run. It includes your runtime schedule, your decision tree and points or choices along the path, and any outcomes associated with them, any mechanics or puzzles that you have that are going to support those outcomes. And so if you don't really have a good understanding of your game matrix, it's hard for anyone, whether it's participants or interactors, to make good choices about how they're going to exist within the world. So your game matrix also needs to be flexible enough that when you come across elements in playtesting that are not working, that you can change them to make the outcomes that you are looking for. And finally, really, game and narrative should be working together as perfect partners. And so if they're in conflict, something is wrong and you need to look at your design more carefully. Step three is creating these characters. So characters are portrayed by the actors or facilitators. I think of these as the non-player characters or NPCs. In some games, there are no NPCs. All roles are played by participants, but many different types of experiences do have these sort of NPC roles. So without a developed character, it's not really possible for someone to make fully informed choices about how they exist in the world. So show writers and directors can suggest some of these ideas, but I think it's really helpful for authenticity to utilize an actor's talents to fully realize the character. Interactive NPC characters should be made with the idea in mind that they're different. They're meant to be interacted with and by the audience, and that means that they're going to have some different qualities. And we're going to get into more depth with that later. Step four is creating relationships. So of course, it's nice for there to be some guidance about certain types of dynamics or types of relationships that exist, but it really benefits a production if the actors are instrumental in collaboratively creating these relationship dynamics with each other. So it has really two major benefits. The first one is memory. It's easier for people to remember relationships that they created or helped to create. And two, authenticity. It really makes it feel more natural and more real if your actors are the ones who are helping to create and add dynamicism to these relationships. So there are a bunch of exercises that you can run to facilitate connection making. And that's a great way to do this, but we're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of that. If you want to learn more about that, then check out my interactive acting series, and that will have a lot more development there. Um, so teaching actors to accept new relationships based on audience participation is also critical. So within the bounds of their comfort, being able to endow or yes and a relationship makes things very interesting on stage. And then step 5, you've got that contact with participants, right? So the final step really comes when you put the work together and present it to an audience. And so when this happens, no matter how much preparation you've done, you have to accept that when your work meets the participants, things are going to change. Ask any LARP runner ever. Like, things change as audiences and participants interact with things. So that means that you're going to have staff that can roll with rapid changes and be in a fluid environment. And that really requires trust as well as resiliency among your collaborators. So finally, as you're kind of meeting the participants and interacting with them, interactors are going to start to develop this ability to sort of split their consciousness. And they'll be able to pay attention both in scenario and respond in scenario, as well as kind of out of scenario. And this is something that scholars have called dual consciousness or bisociation. And when a performer is able to do this effectively, they can become really good at something that we call steering. So here's kind of a mental model of how bisociation in interactive performance works. So you can see that over here on this kind of light pink side, we've got the mechanical, like this is your physical manifestation, movement, sounds, mannerisms. These things are diegetic, right? They're character driven. Your presence, like giving focus and energy usually to a scene or a scene partner or other partners in the scene. These are diegetic. Monitor, this is like receiving information about the unfolding scenario. That is both your diegetic as well as non-diegetic, so character and actor driven. And then your orchestrator is this meta observer who holds and devises possibilities on the fly, and that is purely actor driven, right? So you, as you start to get good at this type of interactive performance, you'll notice that these different areas start to become stronger, and the ability to develop your orchestrator and devise things on the fly and roll with things really easily gets stronger and stronger and stronger. This is something that I think is also really beneficial for actors to practice, even if you are not an interactive actor, because it makes you stronger and more resilient overall with your regular acting training as well. So today we're really going to kind of be focusing on just the steps 1 through 3, which is kind of the writing and pre-production parts of the process. So first of all, I like to start with foundations, and these are kind of essential design concepts that help you to write. So first I want to talk about core concept. So core concept is how you describe the core experience of your game. It includes the central idea for your game, core gameplay aspects, who the players represent, how they're going to engage with a game. If you can nail down your core concept, it's going to really help you disseminate this idea to your fellow collaborators and eventually to your prospective participants. So this is from a real game that we ran in 2017, I want to say, maybe 18, from a game called Pocket Monsters the Hunted. So Pocket Monsters the Hunted is a horror comedy genre live action role-playing parody game in which the players are starting level Pokemon. Over the course of the game, players experience being captured and trained by familiar iconic trainers as they grow in power and evolve. They will uncover terrifying secrets about the world in which they reside, and soon they will fight for not just the glory of being the best there ever was, but for their very lives. The next up is theme. So theme is kind of what's going to get your players interested in the story. It's really the why that your game exists. And I really like to think of it as like, what is the question you're trying to ask? What interesting question or questions is your game putting out there for people to think about? What do you want people to think about? What do you want people to walk away with? I also think of this as kind of like the emotional core of the game. Like if you can come up with a really solid few types of questions and themes that you're trying to hit, it's going to make your work stronger overall, and it'll really help you with decision making about what to include and what not to include. So, as an example, Pocket Monsters the Hunted explores themes of social justice, revolution, and control of a narrative by an oppressive regime. It asks, what makes a monster? What would you do if you found out you were the unwitting and innocent victim of horrific abuse and tyranny? And who gets to decide how people are treated? Tone. So, tone is how your experience is going to feel, or how you really want it to feel, to those participating in it. And this is by far the most difficult thing to nail down and to communicate to your players, which is also why it's the one of the most important things for you to have perfect clarity on. So it might be useful here to evoke or invoke other inspirational media that has a similar tone to what you're going for. And that helps to make sure that your staff and your players are on the same page, so that they can create characters and create things that are going to actually fit within this world. So, example, the tone of Pocket Monsters the Hunted is a zany mix of over-the-top comedy, gore, and psychological horror in which the players are able to be the ultimate heroes and win the day. So media with a similar tone, Cabin in the Woods, Dale and Tucker versus Evil, Shaun of the Dead, that gives you a really idea of like the vibe of what you're going for. Next, I'm going to talk about world building. So there's an approach to world building called top-down world building. And so if you are engaging in top-down world building, then you start with a really big general overview of the world. So very broad characteristics such as your world's inhabitants, the technology level, geographic features, climate, history. From there, you start to develop the world in increasing detail as you kind of take this very high level and then more narrow and narrow view. So you might create some of your world's basics, then continents, civilizations, nations, cities, towns. A top-down world tends to be pretty well integrated, and individual components can fit together really nicely with this approach. However, it can also require an insane amount of work before you have enough detail to actually create a story. And one of the pitfalls I see with top-down world building is often people get so wrapped up in creating the world that they don't actually know what story they want to tell in that world. And that makes it pretty challenging to get started with actually creating. There's this great resource called Collaborative World Building. So there's this fabulous RIT game design professor, Trent Herringrader. If I got that wrong, Trent, let me know. He wrote this book called Collaborative World Building, and he created these world building cards that are free to print on his website. If you go to collaborativeworldbuilding.com, you can get this resource for free, or you can actually buy his deck and support him, buy his book and buy his deck. So he's got this system where there are these 4 broad structural categories. So governance, economics, social relations, cultural influences, and then you have these 14 substructures beneath them. And there's kind of like a rating system for how deep or broad or like the different kind of like levels at which your world might be participating in these different things. And this is something that you could either assign those kind of metrics to, or you could randomize them and let the chips fall where they may, and take this collaborative world building approach. It's a cool way to kind of take a stab at this top-down approach without getting too bogged down in the details. So world building bottom up, a designer might focus on a very small part of the world that's needed just for their purposes, right? So that location is given very considerable detail, such as the local geography, culture, social structure, government, politics, commerce, history. It might just be for that one town or that one state or something, right? So then they might have prominent local individuals who are described, including their relationships to each other. And then the surrounding areas have a lower level of detail. And that can kind of like the further out you get from your initial place that you world built, the less detail there is, right? And then over time, those areas sort of get filled in. So this approach is really immediate for being able to apply the settings. So you can immediately put a story in this sort of situation. But it also has the pitfall of having a world that can be plagued with inconsistencies as you start to develop different things, and then you start to see that they no longer align or no longer fit. So if you combine your top-down and bottom-up approaches, you can really enjoy the benefits of both. So this is hard to accomplish because you need to start from both sides, and that may create double the amount of work, and that can delay your product even more. So I think it's useful to something called an approach called inferred world building. So that's where you provide enough detail about various parts of the setting that people can extrapolate on what's written to come to their own conclusions regarding specific details that aren't provided. So this is really useful for live action settings, especially as individual games might have details that need to be created on a case-by-case basis in order for the story to function. Further, there's a really a participant benefit for this inferred world building approach, which is that you may want to actually leave sections of your world undeveloped so that participants can help collaboratively write things into the setting that are going to fit with their own character backstories, and they're not going to require you to rewrite your entire rule book or your entire world setting if you leave some of these things sort of intentionally blank. Some helpful questions for you to think about as you're world building are, the physics. Is this real world magic? Is it physics? Is it, to what degree? How does it work? I think I said real world magic. Yeah, because real world has magic. And the cosmology. So what are the bounds of the metaphysical or the scientific? Are there realms or gods or planes or planets? Like what's your cosmology? Your geography, like what's the terrain like? Is it really varied? Does it look Earth-like? Is it nothing like that? What do maps look like? And culture. And some important questions here are not just what are your constructed cultures like, but are you also being sensitive as you create these cultures to issues of appropriation? And how are you ensuring that? And I highly recommend that you check out LARPing in Color, as they provide access to consultants who can help you with answering those very questions. So next is format, and formats are how you're going to actually deliver and present your story. So really thinking about the best way to present your game is a critical step, and that's something that people often miss when they're conceptualizing because they're used to thinking in formats that they're already familiar with. But the truth is that the format of a live action experience is incredibly flexible, and you can and should think outside the box. So just like many other forms of storytelling, like in film and media or written word, right, as examples, sometimes the story you want to tell is a 30-second commercial. Sometimes it's a 14-season epic. Sometimes it's a 3-line poem. Sometimes it's a massive book series. So the point is, don't limit yourself. If your game or live action experience is best experienced in 5 minutes, that's cool. Let it live in that space. If it's best experienced over many weekends, great, so be it. But know what you want to deliver and do it. And so I want to give some examples of some kind of game formats that are pretty classic. So the campaign game, this takes place over the course of multiple years or seasons, and might have weekend-long kind of events, which are episodes in that season. So often this format is pretty heavily PvE, meaning that the game runners actually provide a lot of the content for the players to engage with. And not always, though. That may not be the case, but it has a lot of roots in the American kind of boffer communities. So this often has like both meta plot lines that run across all the seasons, as well as like seasonal villains that help develop the story. So this is, pretty similar to writing like episodic seasonal TV shows kind of thing. And often actually the writer's room is pretty similar to how that works as well. So campaign buffer games might have a planned meta arc, some don't, some have no planned end and just go on forever and ever. So engagement with this format, you often see like physical combat style games. It's completely reasonable to assume that many other engagement mechanics could exist in this format totally seamlessly. And I will say that like I have in buffer games thrown out the rule system and used bespoke mechanics for all kinds of things, for like modules or just, you know, interesting scenes and things like that. So, you know, think of this like a multi-season TV show. Another classic game format is the series game. So a series game takes place over the course of a limited number of play sessions, and that can vary in length from several hours to entire weekends. It can be pretty similar to a campaign game, except that there usually are not multiple seasons, but kind of a single season in which all the storylines are going to be wrapped up or discontinued by the game's end. Series games often create a better balance of player versus environment and player versus player. So, and that's, you know, I think largely due to the fact that if you're playing in a limited series game, you're not going to be super disappointed if you lose a character. But things can easily lean to one side or the other. Like, you know, you can kind of choose how you engage here. And then you'll often see kind of more bespoke conflict resolution systems or engagement mechanics in series games than you will in your kind of like typical buffer combat game. But of course, your mileage may vary. So think of this as like a mini series or limited run series TV show. Another classic game format is the one-shot game. So this game runs its course in a single session, whether that's an entire weekend, a few hours, a matter of minutes. The story is fully told, the storylines are resolved or discontinued at the end of play. And these games are way more frequently have these PvP, player versus player elements, or CVC if you prefer that terminology, character versus character. But again, it can still be entirely PvE. And we see a really big style variance in how people engage with mechanics in these games. And there is a huge taxonomy of terms that attempt to describe different types and flavors and styles of games that emerge within this format, including theater style games, secrets and powers games, interactive literature, freeform games, cheap form games, black box games, short form games, like many other terms. So think of this as like a movie or a short. Now let's talk about mechanics. So mechanics let people know how to engage with your game. The mechanics of a game describe the ways in which players may interact with the different elements of the world and the story that you're presenting. So there's this kind of false dichotomy in design thinking that there's mechanics and theme are kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to game creation. And that might be helpful for some if you're considering sort of a top-down versus bottom-up approach to design. But I really believe that mechanics and theme should really seamlessly blend together in order to create and support that experience that you want to create. So, in other words, don't make interaction mechanics for things you don't want your participants to do. Only create mechanics that reinforce the types of behaviors and interactions that you want people to experience and get rid of the rest. That is my advice. So I'm going to talk about some classic game mechanics. So the first one I'm going to talk about is called gating. So gating is a convenient way that kind of halts plot progress until certain conditions are met. So for example, escape room games are comprised of many gates, and these gates are closed until certain puzzles are solved. So gaining access to certain rooms or information sources or elements that can help develop the story may be gated by any number of different interaction mechanics, puzzles, code words, performing tasks, like all sorts of things. And it's important for a gate to be appropriate to the thing that is gained from the gate. So in other words, if the task is very hard to perform, the payoff should also be big. If the task is easy, then the payoff should be smaller. And also be careful when you're chaining gates. Players will give up if there are too many steps or if things become too difficult for them, unless they are super puzzle people. So just be aware that chaining gates may be too much for some people. So starting with some easier wins and slowly increasing your difficulty is usually a pretty good strategy for if you have a many chained gate sort of underlying system for your game. Conflict resolution. So participants will come into conflict in your world. That's the essence of storytelling. We want that, right? And how you get them to resolve those conflicts are described by the mechanics that you create to allow interaction. So there may be many different ways to think about conflict resolution. So don't get stuck thinking that you should just use what you know. You can design anything. So that said, there's also a bunch of tried and true combat systems that you can utilize if you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So I like to think of like conflict versus combat. These are not the same thing. Like a conflict can include combat, but it doesn't necessarily need to. So as you're building your world, think about, how do participants solve their conflicts? Do they have dialogue? Do they engage in fisticuffs? Is it powers or magic? Is there something else going on? How are they going to resolve conflicts? And then are participants going to physically engage in combat? And if so, how are you going to determine the winner? How are you going to ensure that everybody knows what's happening in the scenario? And how are you going to accommodate accessibility needs? These are important things that I think like really don't have a lot of great answers in I should say yet. Do not yet have the sufficient answers, especially for accessibility, that I think that we need in order to make things more just and equitable. Also, other classic mechanics, skill use. So you want to create meaningful opportunities for players to engage in either real world or in-game skills in order to gather information and further their understanding and further their own personal narratives. So there's this kind of classic paradigm that's often used that I like to use when I'm thinking about how people are going to approach something, thinking of social, physical, and mental. This is a triad that's really classic for allowing people to engage their skills. And you can develop mechanics that support these different types of like interactions, right? So whether they're realistic, like solving a puzzle, or simply analogs for a skill use, so you can just like spend a point and I have a rank in that skill and that gives me the answer. It can also be really satisfying for players to have a variety of different options for engagement. Every brain is different, and so every person is going to have a different preference for the types of interactions they enjoy. So when you're creating mechanics, really consider if you have these things balanced, right? Do you have a social way for people to solve the puzzle? Do you have a physical way for people to solve the puzzle? Do you have a mental way for people to be able to solve the puzzle? Another classic mechanic is contingency envelopes. Contingency envelopes are a great way to help forward the story without spoiling any of the events that you have planned out ahead of time. And these typically take the format of like if-then scenarios, right? Like if then or but. So if you hear a bird singing or a cricket chirping, open this envelope. If you see fireworks, open this envelope. If you tell someone a secret, open this envelope, but only if it's a secret about you. So there's, these are just really simple examples of ways that you can set your characters up for being able to learn more information, both because of events that happen, because of other characters, because of things that happen for them based on like timeline things as well. So contingency envelopes can be a really great way to forward plot. And now we're going to talk a little bit about characters. So things that people develop as they're creating characters include the appearance of the character, right? How they look and how they dress, the voice and tone of the character, what the character sounds like if they speak at all. Do they have an accent? Like, is their voice affected in some way? Like, how do they speak and what do they sound like? Mannerism. So that's how the character holds themselves and how they physically behave. And of course, your backstory. And this is like a really fun thing for people to develop. So this is all the causes and conditions and experiences that the character has kind of leading up to the point of starting the experience. And this backstory should really be thought of as a prologue, right? It's where you're starting the character's journey, not where it ends. So interactive NPC characters should have heart-shaped holes, and that means that they need to have needs that form the fundamental basis of their interactions with and their characterization, i.e., this is their goals and motivations. Honestly, I think that good interactive characters includes participant characters. This should be PC characters as well. But for now, let's just focus on the NPC characters, right? If you're creating an NPC character who doesn't have a need that the players can fulfill, no, start over. Don't do that. You know, these needs have to be embodied ways that the participants, you know, that involves the participants. Good interactive characters can't solve their own problems. They need and they can't solve them with other NPCs. They need the participants in order to move forward. So these needs are often tied into the interaction mechanics. And the character's needs can drive an interaction and get people to successfully perform interactions that allow that story to progress. So as you're building non-playable characters, think about that heart-shaped hole. Think about the needs that they have and how the players are going to help fulfill those needs. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about Gary Izzo's essential qualities. And these are different character qualities that are really useful to have in an interactive NPC character, right? And you don't have to have all of these qualities, but having one or more of these traits makes it easier for participants to want to talk to them. So those essential qualities are extraordinary, which is just what it sounds like. Extraordinary, someone who kind of like has lived an unusual life. They have things about them that are, you know, out of the ordinary. Identifiable, somebody who is easy to pick out in a crowd, like maybe they represent with their manner of dress some sort of like, you know, really specific thing that they're a part of, like they're easy to find and identify. Vulnerable, meaning they need help, right? They can't solve their problems on their own. They need somebody to help them. Fascinating, like often this is kind of mysterious, like this person has secrets or mysteries that they can help give and like elucidate for the players. Approachable means that they give off like a warm or friendly demeanor, right? They kind of are wearing a grin at all times. They seem open. They seem like they want to talk to others and are easy to talk to. And likable. And a way to help create likability is having the character give off the sense that they approve of themselves and they approve of others. So that helps to create that kind of quality of likability. So you know, as you're building your NPCs, like ask yourself if they have at least one of these traits. And if they don't, start to think about like how you can start to incorporate one of these traits and build those things in to make them a little bit easier for participants to talk to. That's it. Thanks for watching this. I hope it has been helpful and useful. And I will be back with more stuff very soon.